I'm Mike McDermott, and today's video is going to focus on two campaigns. Both of them are something of an outlier in the sense that General Washington and the Continental Army that he commanded were not involved in either the invasion of Canada and the effort to include the Canadians in the American Revolution, or the defense of Charleston, South Carolina. Initially, the British attempted to seize Charleston and failed, but ever persistent, they returned sometime later, landed a force ashore, and with the assistance of naval gunfire, were able to not only capture Charleston, but also force the surrender of the American Army that was defending that seaport, the largest surrender of American troops to occur during the Revolutionary War. But first, to the invasion of Canada. Before taking the irrevocable step of declaring independence, the Continental Congress followed a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, they declared loyalty to the British sovereign, at the same time authorizing a vigorous military program. Invading Canada was the first major military effort attempted by the newly formed Continental Army, and it resulted in the Army's first serious defeat. The fledgling force intended to take control of the province of Quebec while convincing French-speaking Canadians to join the revolution, and the effort failed on every count. Poor planning to include short enlistments, inadequate logistic support, vast distances over extremely difficult terrain in the winter, widespread dysentery and smallpox in a largely indifferent and sometimes actually hostile Canadian population, plus a stubborn and resourceful British Army, combined to defeat the American adventure. During the summer of 1775, while General Washington was keeping the British occupied in Boston, members of the Continental Congress had begun to hear rumors that the military governor of Canada was preparing to invade the colonies. Congress instructed General Philip Schuyler, commanding the Northern Department, to preempt the British and seize Quebec. The main thrust of the campaign began from Fort Ticonderoga in late August 1775, and after much hesitation approached St. John's, a Canadian border town and the main British position south of Montreal. The campaign was a sobering experience for the poorly prepared Americans, and the weather didn't help. It was cold and raining, and about half of the 1,200 Americans who initially departed Fort Ticonderoga were sick when they reached St. John's. Those who were able to dig were put to work shoveling out siege lines and gun pits in the mud and the rain before they could begin bombarding the small British garrison. After shelling the British position for 3 weeks, the defenders finally surrendered on the 3rd of November. The weather remained miserable, cold, with drenching rain. General Schneider, now ill, handed over command to General Richard Montgomery, who pressed forward and seized Montreal on 12 November. General Montgomery then learned a second American force led by General Benedict Arnold was approaching Quebec after a rigorous trek through the forests of Maine. General Arnold's troops had departed Cambridge, Massachusetts in September, and after struggling through the wilderness, his soldiers had arrived half-starved and short of supplies. Dr. Isaac Center was a New Hampshire surgeon accompanying General Arnold's expedition. He later provided graphic descriptions of the difficulties the troops encountered after rain ruined the dried fish and the barreled flour and peas. We were on half rations, and many of us were now in a sad plight with diarrhea. Our water was the worst quality. No sooner had it gone down than it was puked up by many of the poor fellows. month into the march, they were less than halfway to Quebec, and provisions had either spoiled or had been consumed, and the men were collecting candles and scraping the hair from rawhide to boil soup. An advance party was able to purchase flour from French settlements in return, and in Dr. Center's words, quote, "Our greatest luxuries now consisted of a little water stiffened with flour in imitation of shoemaker's paste. Instead of diarrhea, which tried our men most shockingly in the former part of our march, the reverse was now the complaint, which continued for many days." Private Abner Stockings wrote of his experience during the same period. "When we arose, many of the company were so weak that they could hardly stand on their legs. When we attempted to march, they reeled about like drunken men. The circumstances of a young Dutchman and his wife, who followed him through this fatiguing march, particularly excited our sensibilities. The husband, exhausted with fatigue and hunger, fell a victim, and his affectionate wife tarried by him until he died. She covered him with leaves and then took his gun and left him with a heavy heart to march with us. The British garrison in Quebec refused to surrender, and the American invaders combined their forces to assault the city in a blinding snowstorm the night of 31 December 1775, New Year's Eve. The attack was a disaster for the Americans, while British casualties were minimal. General Montgomery and about 100 men were killed, while some 400 other Americans were captured. In the words of Private William Humphrey, "There was no possibility of our retreating. They promised us good quarter, and we surrendered ourselves." General Arnold was badly wounded, but insisted on besieging the city until May 1776, when British troops, reinforced by German mercenaries, arrived from England under the command of General John Burgoyne. The British launched a counteroffensive that forced the poorly organized Americans to lift their siege and retreat back to Fort Ticonderoga via Lake Champlain. General Arnold's retreat from Quebec left the survivors, many emaciated and suffering from smallpox, thankful to regain their starting point. While the invasion of Canada was a disaster for the Americans, General Arnold was widely credited with delaying the British during that retreat from Quebec. During that time, the Americans burned St. John's, which they had earlier captured, and General Arnold had sworn he'd be the last man to leave Canada. After ensuring all his troops were embarked for the trip down Lake Champlain, he and his aide, Captain James Wilkinson, who would have a long and checkered career, waited until they heard the drums of the approaching British. Only then, at the last minute, did they shoot their horses and push off in a canoe to complete their trip to Fort Ticonderoga. And now, the campaign to first defend and then eventually surrender Charleston. Charleston, located on inland waterways providing ready access to the Tidewater country, was the principal seaport of the southern colonies. Early in the rebellion, the region's royal governors had assured the British the southern colonies were loyal, and in their view, capturing Charleston was central to rallying the whole region. Meanwhile, the rebels who were in control of the town raised 2 regiments for local defense and a 3rd for frontier duty while strengthening Charleston's defenses. A fort on Sullivan's Island, constructed primarily of palmetto logs, blocked the approach to Charleston's harbor from the sea. Colonel William Moultrie insisted on reinforcing the fort, and on 28 June 1776, a British fleet landed 2,900 troops on a sandbar near Sullivan's Island, but they were unable to carry out the assault because they encountered a channel that was too deep to wade. Several ships then bombarded the fort with little effect. The British threat to Charleston's rebels faded when the fleet retrieved the stranded troops and departed, leaving the town unmolested for the next 4 years. That was when the British made a strategic decision to shift forces to the southern colonies, where they expected greater loyal support. On 26 December 1779, Generals Henry Clinton and Charles Cornwallis sailed from New York with 8,500 soldiers, and after a stormy passage landed the troops about 30 miles south of Charleston on the 11th of February 1780. Once ashore, the British began slowly pushing north, but their approach to the town entailed an arduous advance to include crossing numerous waterways. The construction of British siege lines to isolate the defenders didn't begin until the 1st of April. The town was soon cut off from any relief by sea, as British ships, after sailing past Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, entered the harbor and started shelling Charleston on the 8th of April. By late May, 10,000 British soldiers were working to extend those siege lines and block all land approaches to the town. General Benjamin Lincoln, now commanding the American troops defending Charlestown, faced a serious dilemma. Local authorities insisted he stay and protect the town, and he feared if he withdrew, many people in the region would lose heart and refuse to support the revolution. If he stayed, he risked the loss of the army with all the negative ramifications that would entail. By mid-April, the British were enclosed and his options had disappeared. One of the besiegers, a German captain named John Ewald, had strong memories of South Carolina and the rebels defending Charleston, and he later wrote, "The intolerable heat, the lack of good water, and the billions of sandflies and mosquitoes made up the worst possible nuisance. Moreover, since all our approaches were built in white sandy soil, one could hardly open his eyes during the wind because of the thick dust. I tried to protect my troops as much as possible, but there were at least 100 sharpshooters whose fire was so superior that they no longer dared fire a shot." That is, the German mercenaries no longer dared to fire back at those American sharpshooters. Over the next month, the combined land and naval bombardment grew overwhelming, and the citizens who had previously insisted on General Lincoln's presence now clamored for him to capitulate. On 12 May 1780, General Lincoln surrendered his mixed force of 5,266 Continental and militia troops unconditionally. The British also captured about 300 artillery pieces and 6,000 muskets. The surrender of the Continental Army at Charleston in 1780 was the greatest loss suffered by the Americans during the Revolution. In fact, the number of troops surrendered there more than twice as many as were captured at Fort Washington during the Long Island campaign. American loss of Charleston and General Lincoln's troops was serious, but the fundamental flaw in the British strategy became apparent as popular support for King George proved to be very limited. British regiments soon succeeded in overrunning South Carolina, and they established a string of posts to dominate the interior, while residents were encouraged to come forward and take an oath of allegiance to the crown. Royalists were enrolled in militia units, organized primarily for local defense, and other citizens signed up to serve as British soldiers. The British continued to occupy Charleston throughout the remainder of the Revolutionary War. And the garrison did not leave until the 14th of December, 1782, more than a year after the British surrendered at Yorktown. British sympathizers in Charleston were immediately attacked, thrown out of their houses, and plundered by their neighbors. And in fact, 24 of them were hanged at the harbor, facing the departing British fleet as it sailed away. And so ends the overly enthusiastic and misguided invasion of Canada, the one and only time during the Revolution that the Americans made that effort, and initially the successful defense and then the loss of an army at Charleston. The business of hanging their neighbors who had been loyal to the British Crown is just a symptom of the Civil War that took place throughout the country during the Revolutionary War. And when one side was dominant, their enemies suffered. And in the case of Charleston, as the British fleet sailed away, their friends were hanged. Now, I look forward to your comments. Don't hesitate to let me know what you think about the effort that I'm making here and about the content of these campaigns, and we can open a conversation. Until then, God bless America.